everyone. It is so great to be with you this evening for such an important conversation. You all are in for an absolute treat. I am Rashad Robinson, president of Color of Change. For those of you that don't know us, we are a racial justice organization driven by more than 7 million members, Black folks and allies of every race, working all around the country to translate the presence and visibility that Black people have in the world into the power to actually change the rules. And we are going to have a conversation tonight. I'm going to get to have a conversation, which is such a treat, with two people whose work, intellect, and wins inspire me every single day. The work that both Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Heather Mcgee are doing out in the world is truly inspiring. And this conversation really is about the work to build a future for all of us, a future that is not about a zero-sum game. And we're going to be talking a lot about Heather's inspiring new book. But first, I want to introduce you to my two co-conversationalists who I'll be asking questions to. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley is an activist, a legislator, a survivor, and the first woman of color to be elected to Congress from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Throughout her first term in Congress, Congresswoman Pressley has been a champion for justice, reproductive justice, justice for immigrants, consumer justice, justice for aging Americans, justice for workers, justice for survivors of sexual violence, and justice for the formerly and currently incarcerated. Currently, Congresswoman Pressley serves on two powerful congressional committees, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and the House Committee on Financial Services, where I got to testify just this week, both of which have remained focused on legislatively addressing issues of care, concern, and consequence to the American people. And Heather Mcgee. Heather Mcgee is the New York Times best-selling author of The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone. Yes, New York Times best-selling author. I'll be saying that every time I have to see her now, but that's what happens. It is what racism costs everyone and how we can prosper together. She helped to build Demos, a leading think tank, and served for 4 years as president of that organization. She actually currently serves as board chair of Color of Change, where she helps to guide the organization, working with me and the staff on our strategic direction. So let's jump right in, my friends. Heather, can you tell us why, after 2 decades in public policy work, you left your job as president of Demos to travel the country, researching for this book, and talk to us a little bit about what you discovered?
Well, thank you so much, Rashad, for that generous introduction, for your leadership in the world, for the wins that you keep delivering on behalf of Black people and all of us who struggle. Thank you to the Congresswoman for being part of this conversation. This was like a little bucket list, dream list of people I want to talk to about this book, and you were right up there at the top. So this is so fun for me tonight. And it's great that, thousands of people get to listen to this conversation as well, which feels like a family talk, but I think is actually being broadcast live. And thank you as well to One World, to my publisher and my editor, Chris Jackson, and Mika and Greg and Katie and the whole team. One World is an imprint of Penguin Random House that is publishing some of the most fascinating multicultural books in the society today. So check them out if you do not already know about One World. Okay. So why did I leave my dream job of running a think tank, which I got to do when I was 33 years old, first Black woman running this organization, or really any like it, which for me was just a dream because I cared so much about economic policy, so much about unrigging the rules to make life better for all people who struggled, including my people, Black people, and for everyone. But it felt like when I made the decision in 2017 to leave and go on the journey that would become The Sum of Us, like so many of the issues that I had worked on for the greater part of 20 years, student debt, poverty wages, unfair taxation, rigged rules around democracy, poverty in general, that it was like the tools that we were bringing to the fight were inadequate to the task at hand. And I had to ask myself, why is it that we can't seem to have nice things?
Mm.
And by nice things, I don't mean like self-driving cars, which frankly, I don't think we need, or laundry that does itself, which I would love, but things like really universal healthcare, a reliable modern infrastructure, a public health system to take care of all of us at times of great challenge, like during the pandemic, universal childcare, a well-funded school in every neighborhood. And it just felt like the general conversation about why it was that the country with the biggest economy in the world, with so much power and so much promise, wasn't delivering for its citizens and its people. And so I set off on this journey across the country. I went from Maine to Mississippi to California and back again. I talked to hundreds of people who shared their America with me. And the big insight that really launched the journey was that we are being held back by a zero-sum story of racial hierarchy and competition. The idea that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense. A dollar in my pocket must mean a dollar out of yours. The idea that we're not actually all on the same team. And that zero-sum story is a framework, a story that is held more often by white folks than people of color. We don't actually think that progress for us has to come at white folks' expense. And it's a framework and a story that is sold for profit by people who are benefiting from the economic status quo. And it has meant that what the majority of white people have been voting for politically, a set of policies that robs from all of us, but they cheer it on and they support it out of a sense that they want to make sure that it's not something that's given to people of color, even if it's also something that could benefit them as well. And that's that subterranean story. It's not always conscious, but it's really the thing that is holding together or splitting apart, in fact, the working and middle class who should be united to seek common solutions to our common problems.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of zero-sum game is so important, the zero-sum worldview. You know, Representative Presley, whether it's your time, you know, as a staffer on the Hill, your time in Boston in elected politics, your time now in Congress, you have seen this play out, I'm sure, in so many ways. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you've seen this actually play out as it relates to policy. I've heard you say a number of times that policy is your love language. I think I might be sort of paraphrasing that, but you've said something to that extent. And so to the extent that you have been inside of this policy world, you have seen this play out. And I'd love it if you could touch a little bit on the American Rescue Plan that was just passed and sort of the way in which we saw it play out as that bill sort of moved to signing.
Yeah, okay, well, certainly do my best. But before I get into that, I just want to say how fulfilling and restorative it is to sit at this virtual table with the two of you. I consider you to be kindred spirits, to be my brother and sister, my siblings in movement building work, to be accomplices, you know, in the work of justice. So thank you for being my co-conspirators. It's wonderful to take up this space with the two of you this evening, and necessary, you know. That zero-sum game that Heather, that you wrote about and that you just spoke about so eloquently there, that idea that more for some means less for others, it's a constant shadow in conversations in Washington. And very familiar, you know, from my 8 years on the Boston City Council, we're often these, you know, false, unjust, binary budgetary choices were being foisted onto us. So that zero-sum game, that scarcity mindset. And I've always asserted that there is not a deficit of resource. What there is a deficit of empathy, truly. So, you know, there is a collective commitment to the myth that when it comes to resources, equity, or justice, we're talking about some pie. And a slice for you means less for me. And the reality is that it's a construct that is meant to suppress and to divide. Mm-hmm. America is a very wealthy and well-resourced nation. We do not lack resources. Again, there is a deficit of empathy, a deficit of political courage and will. Mm-hmm. I serve on the Financial Services Committee, and so housing is under that. And I'll never forget the very first full committee hearing we had in the 116th Congress. Shout out to my incredible chairwoman, Maxine Waters. And the first bill to come before that committee was her bill, the End Homelessness Act. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's so much meaning in the titling of a bill, right? The End Homelessness Act. And I love it said end, because we could do that, right? And so when you look up at a slide and it gives you the cost of one military aircraft carrier, and then you see that is the equivalent cost of how this bill has been scored. Mm-hmm. You know, that is the CBO score. I think it was something like 13 plus billion. I mean, something just astronomical. I'll get the exact number and I'll tell everybody before we leave here. But it's like, we could end homelessness for the cost of one military aircraft carrier. And so when I show up in Congress just as I am and push back against this scarcity mindset and push back against this zero-sum game, some see that as radical. I was having this debate earlier today, and we need to be radical. And what is that? You know, Rashad talks about that so often, you know, in the words of Angela Y. Davis, right? To be radical is to get to the root, right? Mm-hmm. So if we want to see radical, transformative, systemic change, a dismantling of systemic and structural racism, a rooting out of the scourge and the evil that is white supremacy, if we want to see everyone's most basic needs met, that's going to require radical truth-telling, radical love, radical policy, and radical healing. And that is what's going to get us to where we need to be as a nation and as a community. And so, Rashad, you asked about the ARP, the American Rescue Plan. So just top line that, because we'll have more time to talk about that. But I pushed hard to secure provisions within the American Rescue Plan. And yes, we were up against many political dynamics and a zero-sum worldview. But the people were on our side. Mm-hmm. And so we just passed a bold bill that is going to give families and workers across the nation the deep relief that they needed. But if we truly want to rescue America, we certainly have much more work to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. Heather, I remember like maybe the first time we actually had like a real dinner. Like I loved you from afar. I don't think you hated me. And I remember the first time we had like dinner at this like place in the city that was like having tapas. I remember because we had like ramps and we were like talking about ramps being in season. And one of the things we talked about was swimming pools. And I remember we talked about it because I had randomly mentioned the Color of Change campaign back around Black kids being denied swimming pools in Philadelphia. And you like lit up and had a whole, like, it was like a thing. You like moved right into a conversation about swimming pools. And I was like, whoa, that's actually not during the first thing I think people want to talk about with me. And you zoomed in on it. So the fact that, you know, you really use this and leveraged the idea of the sort of swimming pool, not the idea, but what has happened with swimming pools, what has happened with public space, particularly in the 60s during the civil rights, and even since then, because Color of Change was battling some of these legacies of some of these issues, even when I first got to the organization. I'm just interested if you can tell a little bit about this sort of pool story, bring people into it, and help people see how it does connect with why we can't have nice things.
That's right. I did not remember that we talked about the pools, but I remember that campaign. It was somebody called the cops on the Black kids, in the private, you know, in the like housing development. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes. Okay. So Back in the 30s and 40s, the country went on a building boom of public amenities, public parks, public schools, libraries, and pools. And it was really part of a governing ethos at the time. It was the New Deal social contract, where coming out of the Gilded Age of inequality and the Great Depression, there was a new consensus that it was actually the government's job to make sure that the rules on the market were strong enough to create fair play and lots of opportunity for small business, and that the government had a role in basically providing for the things we all need in common: workers' rights, Social Security and retirement, massive subsidies for housing, the creation of the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, all of these things to make sure that our people had a decent standard of living. That was sort of the ethos. And public pools were like a nice little cherry on the top, right? It was just this idea of the American dream that our people should have the highest standard of living in America, in the world. But of course, the public pools, like virtually all of what I just described in terms of the other public policy benefits that were given to maintain and create the greatest middle class the world had ever seen, were segregated and whites only in many parts of the country. There was an asterisk to that social contract. There's a part in my book where I list all the free stuff that the government gave to create the white middle class. When in the mid 1950s and early 1960s, Black communities across the country started being able to successfully litigate and say, hey, those are our tax dollars that have created and are maintaining these public pools. We want our kids to be able to swim too. White communities faced a choice. Would they share the public pool that everybody had paid for? And the answer in so many towns across the country, not just in the Jim Crow segregated South, but in Ohio, in Washington State, and New Jersey, they decided instead to drain their public pools rather than let Black families swim too. Now, of course, that meant that white families lost out on something as well. I traveled in the course of writing the book to Montgomery, Alabama, where the Central Park is called Oak Park. It's this beautiful multi-acre park built in the New Deal era, just absolutely gorgeous. And yet there was basically nobody there. It used to be the beating heart of Montgomery sort of society. And it was virtually unoccupied. There were more groundskeepers than there were people. And in the middle of the park, there's this wide, flat expanse rimmed by these old oak trees. And it's where a pool used to be that could hold over 1,000 swimmers. That effective January 1st, 1959, the Montgomery City Council voted to drain, poured in dirt, seeded it over with grass. They sold off the animals in the zoo. They closed down the entire Parks and Recreation Department of the city of Montgomery and kept it closed for a decade. We were well nigh to almost 1970 before the good people of Montgomery, Alabama had a Parks and Recreation Department. And even when they reopened the Parks and Recreation Department, they never rebuilt the pool. Now, why do I tell the story of the pool? Why is that the central metaphor of my book? Why do I talk about drained pool politics? It's not just because I think it's a shame that the country and so many communities lost out on that public meeting place. It's not just because I think it's a shame that that meant that families had to then privatize and have as a private luxury what was once a public good. That was when we started to see the boom of backyard pools being a new amenity in suburban housing. That's where we began to see these private members-only swim clubs cropping up, right? It's this idea of what's once a public good then becomes a private cost, and everyone's in an arms race to figure it out on their own. But it's also because in many ways, that's what happened to our entire politics. That was a time when the fundamental question of, are we going to share this nation with, and the bounty and resources of this nation with everyone who's contributed to it, was put to the American people. And Black and brown folks said, absolutely, yes, we want to be a part of that social contract. And the majority of white voters, beginning after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and said, you know what, the American dream really is going to be for all. The majority of the white voters turned their backs on the party that had brought unparalleled prosperity, the party of the New Deal, once it became the party of civil rights, and generally speaking on the formula and the policies that had created their prosperity. Because government really went from the enforcer of the racial hierarchy to the upender of the racial hierarchy in a very short period of time that then made government suspect. And the rise of the anti-government attitude, which has certainly shaped politics for all of our lifetimes. It's something we just sort of take as a given, that you have that sort of Nixonian Reagan idea that government is the enemy, and that this sort of anti-government politics, which are particularly prevalent among white Americans, is usually about a 20 or 30 percentage point gap in support for government solutions to public problems by race. That's where that really came in. Just very quickly, I want to say this one other stat, which like knocked me over when I read it in the research for my book. So in 1956 and 1960, according to the ANES, a very authoritative regular survey that is done, the 2/3 of white Americans believed that the government ought to provide and guarantee a job for everyone who wanted one, and a guaranteed minimum income in the country so that nobody would fall below a certain level of subsistence. 2/3, almost 70%. Now, I can't even imagine if politics in our lifetime was such that 70% of Americans white Americans wanted a guaranteed job. Okay, so 70% in 1960. By 1964, the share of white Americans supported a job guarantee and an income guarantee cratered in half to just 35%, and it's stayed low ever since. Black folks still love the idea, still thought it would be good, still thought it was important. So I'm like, wait, is this like an error in my spreadsheet? What is going on? But then I looked, I said, okay, so what happened between 1960 and 1964 that could have radically shaped white public opinion? 1963, the March on Washington included a job guarantee as one of the demands, and a minimum wage that was high enough to be a real living wage. 1963 was also when Kennedy went on a campaign about civil rights and began it was the real media coming out of the Democratic Party's endorsement of civil rights. And then, of course, we know that his successor would be the last Democrat to win the majority of the white vote for president up until the most recent election. And so the question is, all of these public policies that had been the formula for creating broadly shared prosperity, faced with integration, the majority of white voters began to reject that formula. And I say that that means that racism has a cost for everyone, because we all know what has been the result of that. Rampant economic inequality, a concentration of wealth at the top, an economy that before the pandemic had nearly half of working adults making just $10 an hour or $18,000 a year. The majority of workers making under $15 are white. We're disproportionately Black and brown, but the majority of low-paid workers are white. And yet we still have a party that rejects all of these public solutions and common solutions to our common problems that still gets the majority of white support. And in the American Rescue Plan, the Republicans felt that they were perfectly free to reject the refilling of the public pool that was represented by that massive level of government support for our economy and for our people, because they really bet that that zero-sum racial politics would hold their coalition together, even though the majority of white people supported the policies attendant in them.
I'm going to, Representative Presley, Congresswoman, I have another question, but before we get to this point around universal job guarantee, because I definitely want you to chime in there, especially because of your leadership on this issue. But I first want to come to you on something else. I want you to respond a little bit to what Heather was saying, in particular, as we looked at the CARES Act, the first CARES Act, and the ways in which Black and brown small businesses did not get the money, the way it was designed. The money went through the big banks. So essentially, right, Black communities were subsidizing white businesses, and businesses in their own communities weren't. Black businesses were, in essence, subsidizing white businesses by not getting their fair share of those resources because of the design of the legislation, because of a private solution of distributing that money, which should have been or could have been a very public solution to distributing that money. These type of things happen in Congress all the time. And this is part of the work and so much of your leadership and others who are moving us in a different direction. But also you may have stories from your own life of, growing up in Chicago, of leading in Boston, of those stories as well, to just pick up off of what Heather was just saying.
I have so many thoughts and certainly so many examples, Rashad. And, first I want to say Black Lives Matter, Black data matters, Black policy matters, Black economists matter, Black movement builders matter, and Black representation matters in the halls of Congress. I mean, we knew in that CARES Act, and by we, I mean, you, myself, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Tri-Caucus, exactly how this would play out. And that's why early on we were fighting to diversify the lenders to include, minority deposit institutions, CDFIs, because we know that historically our businesses are unbanked or underbanked. Certainly we're not having pre-existing relationships with those big banks and would immediately be at a disadvantage. But to your point personally, actually, I've been ruminating on this interchange that I had earlier, this exchange I had earlier today with a colleague who I said, how are you doing? And they said, well, I'm just trying to stay alive. Somebody wants me dead. And it was a white male colleague. And I said, I certainly don't want to take that lightly. I want to hold space for that. And I'm sorry to say that I can relate. And his response was, but I have a wife and a child. Okay. And, it was very illuminating. And I want to just say something about public space, which is that I think that it is not just about a zero-sum mindset or a scarcity mindset, that there was a rejection, it's much more insidious than that, an unwillingness to share not just economic power, but to share space. Because if you share space, then you are subjected to my full humanity. You are seeing me and my family. You are seeing us be joyful, and Black joy, is radical, right? It's a revolution in and of itself, right? And this is why people can be complicit in policy violence that causes hurt and harm. The disproportionate marginalization and oppression of Black Americans and other marginalized groups. And Heather, I'd be interested, into what you think about that. But, I just think that at the basis of sort of exclusivity and white supremacy is the rejection of our full humanity as Black people. It's not wanting to be in proximity.
That's exactly right. I'm still upset. I'm still upset.
I'm still in that story.
But then I was like, I'm not like an independent contractor out here. I have a family and I belong to a community too. And unfortunately, as a Black woman in America, and certainly a Black bald woman navigating America, I did not need the insurrection of January 6th to, in a deeply ancestral way, know what it is to feel fear and the terror of and the threat of white supremacy to every American life and to our democracy. And so for people to be brandishing Trump flags and Confederate flags and erecting nooses on the west lawn of the Capitol, for Black custodians to be cleaning up the mess left behind of a violent white supremacist mob, showing the ultimate dignity they do every day, but patriotism so we could continue to do our work, is as literal as it is a metaphor for America. We have been cleaning up the mess of the violent white supremacist mob for a very long time. So as much as I want to ensure that we are safe in the Capitol, we need to do the work of making sure that we are safe in this nation. And I feel like, Dr. Kendi, and then we'll get into federal jobs guarantee, but, Dr. Kendi and I were talking and he was just like, there's two forms of racism. One that people they see what happened at the Capitol and they say, oh, that's evil, I would never. But then, so that's white supremacy, and they kind of get that. But then they don't get that it is host to systemic and structural racism, which they're actively participating, in both every day.
They don't get that nearly 200 members of Congress who are Republicans voted to act on the lie that animated the mob.
That's right.
I mean, we are remembering, right, the as the case starts, we're looking at sort of what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, right? And in Georgia, and that's a perfect example here as well, because, right, folks look at those men who tracked him down, right? That sort of individual level of white supremacy. But then a culture, right, that told those men that it was okay, that gave them the playbook to call the district attorney, to have the relationships, the district attorney to sort of put it under the rug for a while, where as if there wasn't a whole movement of activists demanding justice for something that was on video, it would have never happened. And so you're absolutely right that this sort of kind of white supremacist individual level that people can identify, and then all the ways in which people are complicit in the rules, holding up the rules, benefiting and profiting from the rules, and all the ways in which those rules animate our experiences. And part of that is the work to disrupt that, the work to hold institutions accountable, the work to advance policies that give us the opportunity to have more. And so I'd love it if you could talk about the universal job guarantee, something that at Color of Change, we're really excited that we're going to be giving our members very soon ways in which to raise their voices on, and ways in which to engage on. But talk a little bit about it and really help us sort of understand the sort of ways in which this is not necessarily a new idea, but this is an idea, especially given where we are at with our economy, with automation, with racial justice being a majoritarian issue, why it's a time where we need to fight for it more than ever.
Yeah, I like to say, old fights, a new day, and I really do hope that that's true. And Heather, listening to you, you are, Sadie Alexander is applauding you, from on high. For those of you who don't know who that is, Sadie Alexander was the first Black woman to earn a PhD in economics. She championed the federal job guarantee, Bayard Rustin, Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr. I like to bring those names up to remind people always that economic justice is racial justice. And the March on Washington, although characterized by many by Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, was a march for jobs and freedom. And so economic justice is racial justice. And, that was really the foundation for the civil rights movement. I always think of the words of Dr. King and saying, like, ostensibly, I'll paraphrase, if we integrate a lunch counter, but you can't afford a sandwich at it, what does it mean? So I was very proud, building on that civil rights legacy, to introduce the federal job guarantee. It's a key unfulfilled demand of the civil rights movement, and really a continuation of that work. And people, and specifically Black women, have been calling for a federal job guarantee for generations. And the premise is really simple. Every person who seeks work should have access to a good job, a union job, a living wage job, one with dignity, healthcare, and all other benefits. Now, sure, critical infrastructure projects could be one function, which we've lifted that up, but also it's a way of, think about formalizing and compensating the caregiving that across America, folks are laboring in love daily to do without any compensation. So this really does go beyond a project-based approach to thinking about salarying the critical functions of our society. Demand for this type of proposal has always been popular with the people. Right now, a federal job guarantee, 92% of people who call this country home support a national job and work training program. And I think, the COVID crisis really makes the case even that much more effectively. So many folks have lost jobs. More still have left the formal workforce, but are laboring to provide necessary and critical functions in our society, like childcare and like elder care. And might I add, in a recession, especially, disabled individuals, transgender individuals, Black folks, other marginalized communities who are very often the last hired are the first fired in an economic recession. And so when people say to me, well, how do we afford this? I'll go back to my point earlier, and I did check my data point there. Yes, we could end homelessness for $13 billion, but instead, that's with a B, we've chosen to purchase a military aircraft carrier, one. We just approved a $750 billion NDAA, right? So this is not a matter of resource, and we're already paying. You know, we're paying given the number of people who are uninsured. We're paying given the number of people who are unhoused, who are unemployed. So this is not only sound policy, but I think a federal job guarantee is really critical to a just and equitable economic recovery from this pandemic.
Yeah. As you all listen to this conversation, first of all, I want to make sure that you're still paying attention to the book. The Sum of Us. It's pinned in the chat of all the different feeds, and so you can definitely check it out. Make your purchase, buy it for someone that you know needs to read it. But also, as you listen to both Congresswoman Presley and Heather Mcgee, both sort of talk about public policy, talk about the things that we need to win. I hope we are all seeing ourselves in this story, in the work that we have to do. We will always lose in the back rooms if we do not have millions of people lined up at the front door. And so while we need to read, while we need to make sure that we are voting for the right folks, we need to make sure that we're constantly engaging in action, raising our voices, making sure that we're putting our energy in places where our demands can be translated into the type of policy changes that move this country forward. This summer, racial justice became a majoritarian issue. Many of us thought that the best we could do was clap outside of our windows or uplift investigative journalism, but it was racial justice that got people into the streets and motivated people to action. And in so many ways, both of you have talked to the sort of impact of racial justice being sort of a driver to solve these problems, racial injustice creating them and racial justice solving them. I would love it if each of you could talk a little bit. Both of you have the chance to talk to a lot of people. Heather, you went around the country both working to write this book, but you spent time in that process talking to real people, who do data, talking to people who have various stories, but also you're hearing a lot of feedback as you travel. And Congresswoman Presley is someone that is legislating, that has a district that you have to go home to, that you're seeing people in deep pain. I think I've heard you say a statistic about Boston that was deeply troubling that you should share about the sort of gap between wealth, between Black households and white households in Boston. If both of you can share a little bit about sort of the pain that people are dealing with and sort of the opportunity that we have in front of us, because I do think that it's so incredibly important that we sort of recognize what's at stake as we're working to fight, and people who are watching recognize why we need them in this fight, why we need more voices standing up, speaking out, and working to make change.
So part of my decision to leave the role of president of Demos and hit the road and listen to people's stories was a gut level understanding that there's some subterranean story in America that is completely immune to all of the charts and graphs and data and white papers and legislative testimony that I was trying to bring to the problem, right? That I could say until I was blue in the face that it was in our economic interest, both for families and for GDP, for us to invest in childcare and healthcare, right? All of the things, right? But ultimately, these questions are really about worth, deservingness, belonging, status, connection. These are questions that in the United States have so often, in fact, always seem to turn on race. And so I sat with so many workers, white people who lost their houses in the financial crisis, Black people who lost their houses in the financial crisis, formerly incarcerated people. It was so much a story of people really sharing their America with me and identifying that through line of this common impediment to our progress of the zero-sum racial hierarchy. But I want to share the story of two workers from Kansas City, one named Terrence and one named Bridget. And they both had very similar stories, right? Terrence, Black man, Bridget is a white woman with bright red hair. And they both worked in fast food. They both were kind of promising high school students who were, got good grades and were on the speech team or, was sort of like a leader on the campus. And then financial pressures, having to basically support their family when their mothers got sick or the bills didn't add up, the bills were too much, meant that they could not go on to college. They had to just go straight into full-time work, which is, a story that they would say is part of their story. And I say that's a policy choice, but moving right along. So they both ended up working 4 decades in fast food and never receiving a wage above the legally permissible bare minimum, which itself, as we know, has not budged in so long. And Terrence talks about how what is really needed in this country is a multiracial working class movement and a new identity for people who work all day and are getting cheated. And he talks about how the first time that he was approached by a Subway, a Wendy's, and a Domino's worker, I think, came in on his shift and said, do you think you should be able to afford to see a doctor? Do you think you should have a living wage? And he said, yeah, I have a family and I've been homeless, even though I've always worked more than one job, right? And then they took the list of demands, which were things like fix the grease trap so there weren't so many grease burns. And they took the list of demands to their manager. And for the first time, everybody on the shift, signed a list of this is what is wrong and took it to the manager. And the manager actually met all the demands. And they said, wait a second, there is something in this coming together. And he said, I remember what it was like when we weren't organized and things just got worse year after year. And then I talked to Bridget, who was this white woman who similar background. Now she was like, they are never going to pay a fast food worker like me $15 an hour. It's just not happening. But she was approached by a fast food worker and she went to the first organizing meeting nonetheless. And a Latina woman stood up and said, this is my life. I have 3 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment with bad plumbing. I feel trapped. And Bridget said, I saw myself in her. Now, Bridget is a woman who had grown up with the zero-sum story. She, everybody was talking in her family, in her neighborhood about the immigrants stealing jobs and coming over and not paying taxes and committing crimes. A lot of dog whistles about the, inner city and the crime and all that, right? She was just sort of steeped in that white story. And she said, it was only when I saw myself in her and I decided to join in and realize that our problems were so common. And this is what you were saying, Congresswoman, about seeing the full humanity. It's that proximity and the permission to see one another's full humanity that was completely transformational for Bridget. And I'll end by saying this. Not only did she then become a leader in the fight for 15 in Kansas City, this group called Stand Up KC, but she also then, because she gave more love and respect and esteem to the brown and Black workers who were shoulder to shoulder with her, whom she had before sort of, held stereotypes about, that made her value her own self higher, right? Because if you believe that people at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchy are so less than, but you're sitting there making the same amount of money as them, that lowers your horizon for what you can dream of for yourself. And that, in a way, is so much what this false racial consciousness has done to white workers, right? Is that they lowered their horizon for what they could dream from themselves in a way to accept, the crumbs of white supremacy instead of the full liberation of justice for all.
I mean, do you think that's fair to have me follow her?
I mean, Congresswoman Presley.
I'm just saying, hard cosign.
Yes.
Where can I go with that? I have a lot of policies I want to offer in response.
Please, yes.
That would be great. It would be great to hear some policies in response. And while you're talking about the policies, both in response to what she talked about, it would also be helpful given both the fact that Heather talked about voting rights in her book and the fact that we are now seeing a huge assault on voting rights right now that has the potential to thwart any potential gains we could make and really transform what it means to be able to have a voice in our democracy. And so I'd love it maybe if you could offer up some policy, but also talk some about voting rights as well in this.
Again, so many thoughts. Okay, so I'll start with two things. The first is many years ago, I had the honor of being a Rodell Fellow through the Aspen Institute. And I was talking about policy. And I remember asking my professor at the time, why are people so resistant or averse to change? And his response was, Ayanna, people are not resistant or averse to change. They're averse to loss. And so every time there has been this, every time that I have felt that people just couldn't see where I was coming from, or there was a resistance or even a violent anti to whatever I was talking about, I would sort of pause and just ask myself, what does this person think they're losing? I would just go back to those words. People aren't averse to change. They're resistant and averse to loss. And I think that has everything to do with what's happening in this moment. Including when it comes to voting rights. Our sibling in the movement, Latasha Brown, reminds us that organized power is realized power. And, I think when we have language matters, right? So when we say D&I, we talk about diversity and inclusion and equity and justice. What are we talking about really? Power, right? And, in Boston, people would always be surprised that I was the first woman of color, first Black woman elected to the Boston City Council. That took 100 years. First person of color, period. And now first Black woman to serve in the House of Representatives representing the Commonwealth. That took 230 years. And my response to that has been, yes, we have led on things like marriage equality and healthcare reform. We have continued to lag in leadership parity when it comes to race and gender. And that is because we understand diversity and we celebrate diversity. We have parades, we raise flags, we wear lapel pins, but we do not understand or appreciate, and by we, I mean the folks that fight it and are resistant, shared power. And that is why we see what is happening in state legislatures throughout the country, Georgia being ground zero. If history is written by the winners, we get to write this page right now because democracy is breathing another day because the most marginalized came together, to your point, Heather, in a multiracial, multi-generational, issues-based activist movement. The most marginalized, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, AAPI, disabled, young, queer, and the most marginalized met the moment. And now this administration has a decisive mandate from the people to now meet the needs of the most marginalized who delivered that victory. So, change is coming, power is growing. And that is exactly why there are our state's efforts to voter suppress, to intimidate, to gerrymander. And that is exactly why we need to pass the Voting Rights Act. And for all of my colleagues across the aisle who had effusive bouquets, verbal bouquets to offer to our ancestor, John Lewis, this is how you honor him.
Yeah.
This is how you honor him. And actually, I'm just asking everybody, we appreciate your likes and your hashtags and your retweets. Sometimes I appreciate you wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, even though you probably didn't buy from a Black vendor. But right now, Let's talk about that some other time.
Yes.
The monetization of our oppression and our liberation. You know, the thing is that the only things that matter in this moment are policies and budgets.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's it. Save your words of appreciation. My love language is policy.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because policy has caused hurt and harm. And so if we can legislate hurt and harm, we can legislate equity, healing, and justice. And that is why we need to cancel student debt. Heather, when I was thinking about stories in my mind, can you believe I have one constituent comes to mind, 76 years old, still paying student debt. I just want to lift this up because this is a nearly $2 trillion crisis. They like to make this simply a millennial Gen Z issue, which it is. But the fastest growing population of student debtors are 50 plus. Mm-hmm. And we know that 85% of Black students feel they have no other choice but to borrow. Mm-hmm. And that they're 5 times more likely to default. Mm-hmm. And that affects your credit score, which determines the trajectory for everything else. Right? So save your words of appreciation, cancel student debt. I'm appealing to the administration. You know, you have executive action, stroke of a pen. Congress gave you the authority through the Higher Education Act. We need to cancel student debt. That's an economic justice issue. It is a racial justice issue. It's critical to a robust and equitable recovery. Mm-hmm. And we need a $15 minimum wage to all the stories that you just shared there and enumerated there, Heather. You know, this will raise the wages for 32 million people and lift 1 million people out of poverty. Mm-hmm. And finally, there's a story that comes to mind. You know, a single mom called me, much like the household I was raised in, raising a young daughter, essential worker. And she said, you know, I don't feel well, but I've been told I have to report to work tomorrow. I have no one to watch my child. I can't bring her to work. Mm-hmm. And she called me at 11 o'clock at night. Somehow she got my cell phone number and she said, can you promise me if I don't go to work tomorrow that I'll still have a job? And I could not give her that guarantee in the middle of a pandemic. Mm-hmm. So we need paid leave. Mm-hmm. So these are the stories. So we need to, you know, increase the federal minimum wage to $15. We need to cancel student debt. We need paid leave. And because I'm greedy, because I'm an Aquarius and that's how we move. We gotta, you know, dismantle this carceral state. Yes. And you know, use my People's Justice Guarantee as a framework, you know, to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's so great. If you're just tuning in, we're going to be wrapping up soon, but you know the whole video will be on the Color of Change Facebook page, and so you can check it out. I am here with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I'm here with New York Times bestselling author Heather Mcgee, talking about her new book, The Sum of Us. And in The Sum of Us, Heather, you talk about something that you talk about as the Solidarity Dividend framework, and you talk about it as you know, as a you know, helping people think about how we actually come together, how we can get to having nice things. Can you talk a little bit about the Solidarity framework? And I think it would be the Solidarity Dividend framework, and I think it would be helpful for our members. Given that we also just will be having a conversation soon with Senator Elizabeth Warren and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee about reparations and also about the Tulsa massacre that folks will be able to see on the Color of Change platforms. If you can talk a little bit about how the Solidarity Dividend connects to reparations.
That's good content right there. Okay.
Well, this is great content. See? See?
Okay. So the Solidarity Dividend is something I began to refer to as I saw it all over the country as I was unearthing these stories. It's the opposite of the zero sum. It's the opposite of the drained pool. It's what we can gain when we link up arms across lines of race and recognize the power in numbers, the power of finding common solutions to our common problems. It's the things that we can achieve together that we simply cannot achieve on our own. Cleaner air, higher wages, better funded schools, universal healthcare, childcare, paid family leave, right? All of these things that it's going to take a multiracial coalition to win to, challenge concentrated power and wealth in order to gain for our people, but that it is a dividend that we can all enjoy, but only through solidarity. And when we have this divide and conquer strategy playing out, are still out of reach. So that's the solidarity dividend. I'm so glad you asked me about reparations, because since my book is subtitled What Racism Costs Everyone, you could say, oh, well, if racism costs everybody, well, then we don't need Black people to have these special reparations, right? Everybody has borne the cost. That is not quite true. I say throughout the book that racism always hits its target, right? It hits Black, brown, and Indigenous people first and worst. And yet, because it is such a distorting force in our politics and our policymaking, it bears costs for everyone. That is why, in the conclusion, when I talk about what we need to do, once we've recognized the way that racism has held the pen as we have created so many of our laws and policies, how do we undo it? We go back to the drained pool. We refill the pool of public goods for everyone. And that does mean things like nearly $2 trillion in an American Rescue Plan that's going to cut child poverty in half, that's going to give money for homelessness, for Indigenous communities, for Black farmers, the school lunches, the list, public transit, the list goes on, right? It's that kind of thing. But because of the way that racism held the pen, as so many of our wealth building and economic policies and laws were written, we are not all standing at the same depth at the bottom of that drained pool right now. There's some of us who are completely underwater, some of us who are just treading water. And so, of course, we need reparations. If you read the Some of Us, you get the list of free stuff that was handed out to white Americans to build the white middle class that has created a massive racial wealth divide that Black folks cannot work or educate our way out of. When we talk about student debt, I have a whole half a chapter about the decision to move from public colleges that are paid for by the government and free government grants for a white college going population to this debt for diploma system for a predominantly of color college going population. That is drained pool politics right there. And it is costing all of us, but Black families the most. So what are reparations in the context of a solidarity dividend? I believe you cannot know an iota of the truth and the extent of the way that it was government policy that stripped wealth from Black folks and denied us the ability to aggregate wealth, and not say that, of course, just as the subsidies to home ownership and retirement security transformed the lives of tens of millions of white ethnic immigrants that then created untold prosperity and people with the freedom to start businesses and invent things. Of course, our entire society would be better off if your average Black family had that little bit of cushion. Mm-hmm. Of course we would. Think about what we have done the math to return the moon landing without that intergenerational wealth, without that cushion, without that platform. So I don't see reparations from a zero-sum lens. It's not going to be white people writing a check for their nearest Black neighbor. It's about the government doing what is right. The government that we all pay into, that protects and invests in us all. Reparations are seed capital for the America we deserve and that we are becoming. And everybody should be on board with that.
Seed capital, yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Seed capital for the America that we all deserve. Thank you for that, Heather. Thank you both. We are coming to a close. I know that I could spend another hour talking about all these things. I could, there's so many other things I want to dig into, but I do want folks who are watching, to follow up on the federal job guarantee that Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has been championing, as well as the work around things like baby bonds and other sort of policies that the Congresswoman has been a true champion on, to buy Heather Mcgee's book, to follow us at Color of Change, to take action, to translate presence into power, the visibility and awareness into the efforts and the action that actually lead us to real change. This is such a treat to be in a conversation for this hour with two folks who just absolutely inspire me. Congresswoman Presley, Heather Mcgee, I feel so full and so lucky to have you all as leaders that I get to follow. And I know our members at Color of Change and everyone watching feels the same. Thank you both, and let's get out and let's get some more wins.
That's right. Thank you, Rashad. Thank you, Color of Change. Thank you, One World. Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you all. Be safe.
You,
yes, thank you. And thank you, One World. Appreciate you all. Thank you.